The Red Army entered Afghanistan armed with a doctrine built for an entirely different war. Soviet military thinking was shaped by the expectation of large-scale conflict in Europe, fast-moving armored thrusts, heavy artillery preparation, and rigid chains of command designed to overpower a visible, organized enemy. Afghanistan offered none of that. There were no front lines to break, no formations to encircle, no decisive battles to win. The Soviet machine arrived fully assembled, but the battlefield refused to cooperate. Mechanized columns became symbols of vulnerability rather than strength. Tanks and armored personnel carriers, designed to dominate open terrain, were forced onto narrow mountain roads where maneuver was impossible and ambush was inevitable. A single destroyed vehicle could halt an entire convoy for hours. Soviet units advanced according to schedules and orders, while their enemy operated according to opportunity. Every movement was predictable, every routine observed, memorized, and exploited. Command structures that relied on centralized control collapsed under Afghan conditions. Junior officers had little freedom to adapt, while decisions made far away failed to reflect realities on the ground. Soldiers trained to fight NATO forces now found themselves guarding villages they did not understand, searching mountains they could not control, and reacting to attacks that ended before reinforcements could arrive. Firepower was overwhelming, but intelligence was scarce. The Red Army could destroy terrain, but it could not dominate it. Most critically, Soviet doctrine assumed that force alone could impose stability. In Afghanistan, every aggressive sweep, every bombardment, and every forced relocation hardened resistance rather than breaking it. Villages emptied before columns arrived. Fighters vanished into terrain that had no edges and no limits. The Red Army was fighting by the book, but Afghanistan was not a war that could be read, studied, or solved. It had to be endured, and endurance was already slipping away. In December 1979, the Soviet Union crossed a line it believed would barely be noticed. Columns of Red Army troops poured into Afghanistan under the assumption of control, order, and speed. Moscow did not see an invasion, it saw a corrective intervention. A friendly regime would be stabilized, resistance would be crushed, and within months the war would be over. On paper, the operation looked manageable. The Soviet Union was a global superpower. Afghanistan was poor, fractured, and technologically primitive. History, however, was waiting to disagree. Afghanistan was not a battlefield designed for modern armies. It was a land shaped by mountains that scraped the sky, valleys that swallowed convoys, and villages bound by loyalty not to governments, but to tribe, faith, and survival. Every road narrowed into a choke point. Every hill could hide an enemy. The Red Army entered with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and rigid command structures forged for European warfare. What they faced was not an army in formation, but a society that had resisted outsiders for centuries. Soviet planners underestimated more than terrain. They misunderstood the nature of Afghan resistance. There was no single enemy headquarters to destroy, no capital whose capture would end the fight. Opposition was scattered, local, and deeply personal. To the Mujahedeen, this was not a political conflict. It was a defensive jihad, a war for land, honor, and belief. The Soviets arrived with ideology and firepower. The Afghans responded with patience and memory. Within weeks, the illusion of a quick victory began to crack. Supply lines stretched thin. Garrisons became isolated islands of fear. Soldiers trained for mechanized warfare found themselves pinned down by invisible enemies who chose when to strike and when to disappear. Afghanistan was not conquering the Red Army in battle. It was absorbing it, slowly, relentlessly, and without mercy. The Mujahedeen did not fight the Soviet Union head-on. They did not need to. Their war was built on invisibility, patience, and an understanding of Afghanistan that no foreign army could replicate. Fighters moved as villagers by day and warriors by night, blending into terrain and populations so completely that the line between civilian and combatant disappeared. The battlefield was not marked by maps or objectives, but by memory, every path, cave, and ridge passed down through generations. Ambush was the foundation of Mujahedeen warfare. Soviet convoys were watched for days, sometimes weeks, before a single shot was fired. Attacks came at the weakest moment, on steep climbs, narrow passes, or river crossings, then vanished before retaliation could be organized. There was no attempt to hold ground. Survival was victory. Every Soviet casualty carried psychological weight far beyond its number, feeding doubt and fear inside isolated garrisons. Weapons were simple, often outdated, but used with precision. Rifles, rocket launchers, and mines were placed where armor and air power lost their advantage. Knowledge replaced technology. Faith replaced hierarchy. Fighters answered to local commanders, not distant capitals, allowing tactics to shift instantly as conditions changed. When pressure increased, resistance melted away, only to reappear somewhere else. More powerful than any weapon was belief. For the Mujahedeen, the war was sacred, personal, and existential. This conviction sustained them through losses that would have broken conventional armies. The Soviets could seize territory, occupy villages, and declare success. The Mujahedeen needed only to endure. As months turned into years, it became clear that Afghanistan was not resisting defeat, it was redefining what victory meant. As ground operations stalled, the Soviet Union turned to the sky. Air power became the Red Army's most reliable weapon in a war that refused to stay still. Helicopter gunships and strike aircraft roamed the mountains, hunting fighters who could not be fixed in place. From above, Afghanistan looked conquerable. Villages, valleys, and supply routes could be seen, targeted, and destroyed. For Soviet commanders, air superiority promised control where ground forces had failed. The Mi-24 Hind helicopter became a symbol of Soviet dominance. Heavily armored and heavily armed, it was both transport and gunship, capable of delivering troops and unleashing devastating fire in seconds. Its presence inspired fear across the countryside. Rockets, cannons, and bombs turned suspected Mujahedeen hideouts into smoking craters. Entire regions were punished to deny shelter and support to resistance fighters. The strategy was simple: remove the population, remove the enemy. But terror from the sky had limits. Airstrikes destroyed buildings, not resolve. The Mujahedeen adapted quickly, moving only at night, hiding in caves, and dispersing into smaller units. Bombed villages became recruitment grounds. Each destroyed home hardened hatred and reinforced the belief that survival depended on resistance. The sky belonged to the Soviets, but the ground still belonged to Afghanistan. By relying on air power, the Red Army revealed its own frustration. Helicopters and jets could kill, intimidate, and dominate visually, but they could not occupy every valley or guard every path. The war became a cycle of strikes and disappearances, explosions followed by silence. The Soviets could rain fire from above, yet every morning the enemy returned, untouched in spirit and increasingly confident that time itself was on their side. By the early 1980s, both sides began to change. The war was no longer a shock to be absorbed, but a reality to be managed. Soviet commanders slowly adjusted their tactics, reducing large armored sweeps and increasing the use of smaller, more mobile units. Spetsnaz forces were deployed to hunt supply routes, conduct night raids, and disrupt cross-border support. The Red Army was learning, but it was learning late and at a high cost. At the same time, the Mujahedeen grew stronger. External support expanded quietly but decisively. Weapons improved, training deepened, and coordination between resistance groups increased. The battlefield became more lethal, especially for Soviet aircraft. Helicopters that once ruled the skies now faced growing risk, forced to fly higher, strike faster, and withdraw sooner. Each loss echoed loudly inside a military already struggling with morale and purpose. The war shifted into a grinding stalemate. No side could deliver a decisive blow. Soviet forces controlled cities and major roads, while the countryside remained contested, unstable, and hostile. Every operation demanded enormous resources for limited gain. Soldiers rotated in and out of Afghanistan, carrying stories of ambushes, burned villages, and endless patrols that achieved nothing permanent. Confidence eroded not through defeat, but through repetition. By 1985, the cost of adaptation had become undeniable. The Soviet Union was spending blood, equipment, and prestige on a war that offered no victory in return. Afghanistan was no longer just a military problem, it was a political wound. The Red Army had not been destroyed, but it was being worn down, piece by piece, by an enemy that understood one simple truth: time was the most powerful weapon on the battlefield. By 1985, the Soviet war in Afghanistan had lost its original meaning. What began as a confident intervention had turned into a slow, corrosive struggle with no clear end. The Red Army still possessed overwhelming firepower, yet its presence felt increasingly fragile. Soldiers no longer spoke of victory, They spoke of survival, rotation dates, and the invisible enemy that never stayed long enough to be destroyed. Afghanistan had become a place where power existed without control. The psychological cost was as devastating as the physical one. Young conscripts arrived believing they were defending socialism and stability, only to encounter a war that offered no clarity or glory. Ambushes, mines, and sudden attacks eroded trust in every road, every village, every shadow. Letters home carried confusion instead of triumph. Inside the Soviet Union, public faith in the war quietly weakened, while officials struggled to justify a conflict that consumed resources without delivering results. For the Mujahedeen, endurance had become proof of victory. They did not need to defeat the Red Army in open battle, they only needed to remain unbroken. Each year the Soviets stayed, the narrative of resistance grew stronger. Afghanistan transformed into a symbol, not just of foreign occupation, but of the limits of superpower ambition. The mountains did not celebrate triumph, but they remembered every army that had tried and failed to dominate them. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that the Soviet Union was bleeding in silence. Afghanistan had become a strategic trap, draining morale, economy, and global prestige. The war would continue for years, but its outcome was already taking shape. The Red Army had entered Afghanistan as a conqueror. It was leaving behind something far more dangerous for an empire: doubt, exhaustion, and the realization that even the strongest powers can be defeated, not in a single battle, but across time itself.